Tonight at 10, we're in Glasgow, where the Climate Summit has opened with an appeal from the Queen for leaders to rise above politics. At tonight's royal reception, hosted by the Prince of Wales, delegates were reflecting on the Queen's call for true statesmanship to avert a climate disaster.
We none of us will live forever. But we are doing this not for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children, and those who will follow in their footsteps.
Earlier, more than 100 world leaders swept into Glasgow amid massive security for the biggest summit ever hosted in the UK. Boris Johnson told fellow leaders he wanted countries to end the use of coal, to phase out petrol engines, and to reverse deforestation.
The longer we fail to act, the worse it gets, and the higher the price when we are eventually forced by catastrophe to act.
If you're here today, you know what climate change is doing to us. You don't need my pain or my tears to know that we're in a crisis.
Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
Outside, protesters demanded much more radical action, accusing the summit leaders of being full of hot air.
Also tonight, the driver of one of two trains involved in a collision near Salisbury suffers life-changing injuries. Several others were hurt. The chief executive of Barclays resigns after an inquiry into links with the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
Helps it away.
And Josh Butler's big hitting makes it 4 wins out of 4 for England at the T20 World Cup.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel. Wonderful Wolves in Wonderland against woeful Everton. Will the Toffees fight back? We'll have all the analysis from Molyneux.
Good evening from Glasgow, where world leaders have been dining with the Prince of Wales and senior members of the royal family tonight at the end of the opening day of the Climate Summit. The Queen, whose doctors advised her not to attend, greeted the delegates with a recorded message, urging them to rise above politics to achieve true statesmanship and reminding them that the benefits of action will be for future generations, not for everyone alive today. When the summit opened at noon, delegates heard a series of powerful appeals for rapid progress. Boris Johnson said that humanity had long since run down the clock on climate change. It was now 1 minute to midnight, he said. The Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, warned that following a path of greed and selfishness would lead to destruction. And the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, said that countries were digging their own graves by failing to act on climate change. Among the goals being discussed here are ending the use of coal, phasing out petrol-powered cars and reversing the process of deforestation. Our first report on events in Glasgow is by our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
A red London bus, electric of course, with a scarl of Scottish pipes. The royals on the steps, the Prime Minister, the host, a full-on UK display. The leaders of the world, the guests, here to be addressed by the 95-year-old monarch, even if not in person. She's seen plenty of their type before.
It has sometimes been observed that what leaders do for their people today is government and politics. But what they do for the people of tomorrow, that is statesmanship. I, for one, hope that this conference will be one of those rare occasions where everyone will have the chance to rise above the politics of the moment and achieve true statesmanship. It is the hope of many that the legacy of this summit written in history books yet to be printed, will describe you as the leaders who did not pass up the opportunity. We none of us will live forever. But we are doing this not for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children, and those who will follow in their footsteps.
Ask me where I'm going.
It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now.
The leaders of some of the biggest polluters, China, Russia and Turkey, haven't shown keeping much more than a social distance.
The anger and the impatience of the world will be uncontainable unless we make this COP26 in Glasgow the moment when we get real about climate change. They will not forgive us. They will know that Glasgow was the historic turning point when history failed to turn.
The platform also for those people whose way of life is at grave risk right now.
The earth is speaking. She tells us that we have no more time.
The UK is the host to a rainbow of nearly 200 countries and wants them all to promise to cut their own carbon emissions, and the wealthier to cough up more towards the $100 billion pot to help poorer countries go green. There is a real sense of purpose here, but it will be a long fortnight, as President Biden and the other leaders must be all too aware. And not all of them are as enthusiastic as the West with wealthier populations, whether Brazil...
Sempre fomos parte da solução, não do problema.
With some new promises today, or a slower approach from the Indian Prime Minister, who says his mega economy will balance carbon emissions with absorbing greenhouse gases by 2070.
2070 tak.
20 years later than Boris Johnson wants. But the mood in Glasgow is perhaps darkening towards those who are dragging their feet.
In 2 generations' time, they will be remembered for this fortnight. They could have been brilliant in everything else they've done, and they will be cursed if they don't get this right.
That's interesting. You use the phrase cursed, which, for somebody in your position of authority, that's a very strong word to use.
It was consciously a strong word. It will be, people will speak of them in far stronger terms than we speak today of the politicians of the 30s, of the politicians who ignored what was happening in Nazi Germany, because this will kill people all around the world for generations, and we will have no means of averting it.
He later apologised for making the comparison to the Nazi genocide. Number 10 stepped down, commenting on the nature of those claims, but said there's no doubt about the seriousness of the climate challenge. It's only day 1 of a discussion. It's already taken more than 2 decades, but the consequences of Glasgow's conversation will be felt far longer than that.
And Hugh, just think, you've had that very personal appeal to world leaders from the Queen tonight. You've had repeated, very vivid demands from Boris Johnson to his counterparts in the last 48 hours. There's no question that the UK is trying to flex every muscle at its disposal, really to try to persuade, to cajole, to say to leaders from right around the world that this fortnight has to mean something beyond this huge event here in Glasgow. It really has to be a moment when things change for the better for decades to come. But remember, the UK is the host. It has the power to try to move the conversation in a direction. But at the end of the day, even the best host can account for the conduct of all the guests.
Laura, many thanks once again. Laura Kuensberg there with the latest analysis just over in the conference centre. And as Laura was indicating, there are some very specific climate targets to be discussed in the coming 12 days. The main goal, by far the most important according to the experts, is to keep the rise in global warming to 1.5 degrees to avert the worst effects of climate change. So far, the rise in temperature has already reached at least 1.1 degrees above the average level of the pre-industrial period. And the problem is that even if current pledges are honoured, the world is still on course for a hugely damaging increase of 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. Our science editor David Schuckman looks at what the negotiators here need to achieve in the days ahead.
A credible strategy.
The world is heating up, and despite all the talk about climate change, we're still heading for catastrophic temperatures. So this is a chance to pick a safer course. But these giant conferences, bringing together thousands of people over the past 25 years, have always been challenging. This is the 10th that I've been to. It's amazing that despite the pandemic, so many people have managed to get here. The rule is to be masked up whenever you're moving around. And the main focus for all the delegates who are here actually happens in giant meeting halls through there. That's where they've got to tackle the toughest question. What matters most is emissions of the gases heating the planet. They're heading in the wrong direction, projected to rise by 16% by 2030, just as the science couldn't be clearer that they need to fall by 45% over that time. And the fear is that this is rebounding on us.
It's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
Powerful words, but with nearly 200 countries represented here, there are so many different agendas. That's why progress is usually slow. If you're sitting down, you can take your mask off, and it's often in places like this that small informal groups of negotiators will get together to try to crack the hardest questions, like getting aid to the poorest nations who are hit hardest by climate change. I've seen for myself how droughts and other extremes of weather can devastate the nations least able to cope. There was a promise of assistance more than a decade ago, but it still hasn't been fulfilled.
The faith in the international process, it becomes a little weaker. There's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of unhappiness because we keep saying everybody has to do this together, but some have more responsibility than others.
And while the talks are underway, the countries show off what they're doing for climate change. And the hope is to encourage practical steps, like phasing out coal, the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, and pushing the spread of cleaner electric vehicles. And that's the message from Sir David Attenborough, that humans can be the greatest problem solvers.
In my lifetime, I've witnessed a terrible decline. In yours, you could and should witness a wonderful recovery. That desperate hope, ladies and gentlemen, is why the world is looking to you and why you are here. Thank you.
A call to action, well received, but what matters now is how the governments of the world actually respond.
So let's get the latest thoughts tonight from David, who joins us from another part of the arena. David, we've heard some words from India today. We'll have your thoughts on that and indeed on the latest message from China.
Yes, I think it's fair to say, Hugh, that the ground has shifted a little bit here today with India's announcement. Yes, declaring you'll be net zero by 2070 is a very long way off, but to say that half your energy will come from renewable sources by 2030, that's a pretty meaningful target. And it's been very widely welcomed, not least because for years India had said as a developing country it wouldn't accept international climate targets of this kind. On the other hand, China, you mentioned, sticking to its current policies, President Xi in fact saying it's Western countries that need to take the lead when it comes to tackling climate change. And meanwhile, a group of small island states who feel that their very existence is threatened, so fed up with the slow pace of all of this, they've decided to mount a legal challenge at a UN tribunal to try to win compensation. So as things stand, perhaps that little bit of progress, but the world is still heading in the wrong direction when it comes to dangerous warming.
David, thanks again. We'll see what happens tomorrow, of course, and we'll talk again then. David Shuckman there, our science editor. We'll have more from the Climate Summit here later in the programme, but now let's join Clive with the day's other news.
Hugh, thank you for that. The driver of one of two trains involved in a collision last night near Salisbury in Wiltshire has suffered injuries believed to be life-changing. An investigation is underway into the cause of the crash, in which several other people were hurt. The collision happened at Fisherton Tunnel in Salisbury around 7 o'clock in the evening. The line will remain closed for the next 3 days, affecting services linking Cardiff and Bristol with the south coast. John Kay has the latest, and a warning his report contains some flashing images.
Questions tonight at the Fisherton Tunnel. These two trains were travelling into Salisbury in the same direction, but somehow collided and ended up side by side.
It mostly hurts in my shoulder up here. That's where the major sprain is that I've been told. So.
Cameron was on board, heading home from a Halloween party, about to get off when suddenly...
This most awful noise, of which I now know is the two trains hitting each other, violently being thrown about as the train they collide, and my train started going at an angle. There's this huge whoosh of fire and sparks. But it's quite scary seeing people with blood on their face or like blood on their masks and clothes. We're a hole in darkness and there's just panic.
Through the window, Cameron took this picture of the other train crashed alongside.
So you're waiting in the dark. What's that wait like?
Time just stretches out and out and out, and it was only when we heard someone had spotted the blue lights on the bridge that's not far from the tunnel that was any idea that help was coming.
To start with, it was thought the Great Western Railway's train had derailed after hitting something in the tunnel, and that the second South Western train had then crashed into it. But this evening, British Transport Police said they have not found any evidence that the first train struck an object. This is now a major investigation. There were almost 100 people on board the two trains. Around 30 of them were treated for minor injuries.
Unfortunately, the driver of the train was more seriously injured, and his injuries are believed to be life-changing. He remains in hospital in a stable condition this morning.
Investigators are trying to establish whether the driver of the first train managed to press the alarm to warn other trains through the signalling system.
When you see pictures of the scene in daylight now, what do you make of what happened?
I think daylight brings about the seriousness of the situation. It kind of reinforces we kind of got really, really lucky in that this wasn't something so much worse.
It could be days before the tunnel entrance is cleared and services can resume. John Kay, BBC News, Salisbury.
The French President Emmanuel Macron has postponed plans to implement sanctions on the UK in the dispute over post-Brexit fishing rights. He said talks would continue tomorrow. Earlier, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said the UK wouldn't roll over after Paris had threatened to block access to its ports for British boats. Our political correspondent Damien Grammaticus has the very latest.
Storm clouds threatening. It's all quiet for now in Jersey, calm in the harbour. The island remains locked in dispute with France, and fishermen here are already getting tangled in this argument. For decades, Natalie Porritt's family have exported Jersey's catch to France. Today she was notified to stay away from the port of Saint-Malo, though France has now said talks can continue for a short period.
We've never seen the industry stop bar COVID. I think we had 2 or 3 weeks where we didn't export into European markets, but for 40 plus years we've worked well with our French neighbours.
The French side said they'll see how things stand on Thursday, if Jersey's authorities might give permission for more French boats to fish in its waters.
We won't succumb to political threats or rhetoric or anecdote. It's clear. At least 10 days fishing in any one of the last 3 years show that you have done that and you're entitled to a licence.
What's extraordinary is that this is a dispute about just a few dozen fishing licences, and it's threatening the relationship between the UK and France. France says it's entitled to them under the terms of its trade deal with the UK. The UK but those boats can't prove they should have access to British and Jersey waters. France's Prime Minister Jean Castex, in a letter to the EU last week, urged action under the trade deal, saying the EU must show it is absolutely determined to ensure the UK fully respects the agreement. If no satisfactory solution can be found, the EU must take corrective measures by putting tariffs on some fisheries products. And he listed access to ports. At the climate summit, clenched fists from the French President and the Prime Minister. But this was a friendly greeting. Tonight, Emmanuel Macron said he'd made a new proposal to de-escalate things. And he understood the UK would bring fresh ideas to push things forward tomorrow.
They have behaved unfairly. The fishing licences were awarded entirely in accordance with the trade deal we negotiated, and we now need them to withdraw those unreasonable threats that they've made.
So the UK says it's glad France has held back, and it expects talks to continue later in the week to try to unravel this dispute. Damien Grammaticus, BBC News.
The government's latest coronavirus figures for the UK show there were 40,077 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average there were 41,081 new cases reported per day in the last week. 40 deaths were recorded, that's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. Today's figure is below average due to some deaths in England not being included because of a technical error. On average, in the past week, 157 related deaths were recorded every day. And more than 8 million people have received their booster jab. This includes third doses for those with certain health conditions. The Barclays chief executive, Jess Staley, has resigned after an inquiry into his links with the sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The city watchdog and the Bank of England have been looking into whether Mr. Staley's relationship with the late financier was closer than first thought. Barclays says it's been made aware of the conclusions of the investigation and Mr. Staley's intention to contest the findings. Well, our business editor Simon Jack is here. So what did the regulators find that prompted the resignation?
Before Jez Staley joined Barclays in 2015, he worked at JP Morgan, where Jeffrey Epstein was a very big, very important client. Now, he doesn't deny he had a relationship with him, but he said that contact was frequent, but it was always very professional. The regulator has found that looking at emails between the two men, they said the volume of them and the tone of them suggest the relationship was a lot closer than Mr. Staley had told the board of Barclays. Now, this is the second time he's had a run-in with the regulators. He got censured, fined for trying to track down a whistleblower. And although he says he's going to contest these findings, the board and Mr. Staley felt that it's very difficult for him to run the bank if he's in open dispute with the regulator. As I say, he's going to contest these findings. Doubly disappointing for him. He fought off a shareholder rebellion where the board backed him, and that his strategy was beginning to bear fruit. The bank was doing very well. After a 40-year career, he's certainly not going to want this to be his legacy. As I say, as we sit here tonight, he intends to contest these findings, but it will not be as the chief executive of Barclays.
Sure. OK, Simon, thank you. Simon Jack there. England's cricketers are on the brink of the semi-finals at the T20 World Cup after their fourth win of the tournament. An outstanding performance from Jos Buttler helped them maintain their perfect record after beating Sri Lanka. Here's Joe Wilson.
England's invincible batters. Where's this going? Oh, there. It's a World Cup, and Sri Lanka were desperate to win this match. Here's another.
Oh, that's out.
Early wickets made spirits soar in those seats. Who's left? Well, Jos Buttler. Nobody hits a cricket ball better. He paced this innings. By the time he'd finished, England's total was 163. Sri Lanka's shock. How did they get that far? Facing the last ball, Buttler needed a 6 to reach his personal 100.
He is enjoying a fantastic tournament.
It is so hard to make it look that easy. But Sri Lanka have their big hitters too. Wanindo Hasaranga kept the chase on. England's fastest bowler, Tamal Mills, went off. He's had wretched luck with injuries. Sri Lanka still hunting. Jos Buttler had the ball. What?
Oh, brilliant from Jos Buttler.
Watch this run out. Sri Lanka soon 137 all out. Jos Buttler, just perfect. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
Now, let's return to our top story, the climate summit, COP26, and to Hugh in Glasgow. Hugh.
Clive, many thanks once again. Well, this global event, taking place a year later than planned because of the pandemic, has brought around 25,000 delegates to Scotland's biggest city, and it's certainly caused plenty of disruption here. But it's also a good opportunity for Glasgow to demonstrate its own efforts to reduce carbon emissions, with a target of net zero by the year 2030. Our Scotland editor Sarah Smith has the story.
Watertight security, road closures and congestion may be a small price to pay for a global climate agreement bearing Glasgow's name. Free, fully electric buses are running around the city. Visitors at the bus depot get a full virtual reality glimpse of what a greener Glasgow could look like.
Of zero carbon transport.
This is the largest electric vehicle charging hub in the UK, with the capacity to power a small town or 150 fully electric buses.
Total cost of ownership now is at a point where it's level with diesel, or maybe even going slightly lower than diesel. It means that we can start moving to electric vehicles, and we can then keep the fares as low as we possibly can to the customers.
This whole setup cost £9 million, with 75% of the cost met by the Scottish Government. Scotland is aiming to get to net zero 5 years before the rest of the UK by 2045. COP26 provides Glasgow, the whole of Scotland in fact, with an opportunity to showcase its green credentials. But it also brings increased scrutiny. The Scottish Government has missed its climate targets for each of the last 3 years. Increased investment in transport is a major plank in its catch-up plan.
With a wee scrub up will be absolutely perfect.
Buying and selling second-hand goods is nothing new, quite literally, but can significantly reduce your carbon footprint. This children's shop is one part of Glasgow's efforts to be one of the world's first cities with a circular economy. That's one that eliminates waste by reusing products and materials.
I think in the past, even operations like this, we talk about our low-cost goods and the quality and choice of stuff that we've got, and maybe we've been a little bit scared to talk about the environmental impact. We've not wanted to seem too green or hippie, but actually people now, that is the conversation.
Charity workers who are nurturing parts of Glasgow's urban woodland demand COP26 succeeds.
I hope it will. It has to. It must do. And if it doesn't, then we have the right to be incredibly angry.
I have more faith in the grassroots things that are happening in Glasgow and around the world than I do in the COP system.
Glasgow's own environment is being tested now by a bin workers' strike over the next week. Piles of rubbish are not what anyone wants this summit to be remembered for. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
Indeed, there's more from Glasgow here on BBC One coming up shortly. Here's Kirsty Walk.
Straight after the news, do stick with us. We're at COP26 in Glasgow with a young audience from all over the world. They're going to be putting 4 international political figures on the spot about everything from coal mining to electric cars. That's at 10:30 on BBC One.
Kirsty, with that debate coming up. That's it for tonight. We'll be back in Glasgow tomorrow to assess if the conference is making progress towards achieving its goals. But now, BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.